Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody around the world across the 7 continents. My name is Juan Carlos, and as you already know, I'm the host of the Psych Life Podcast and the CEO of Psych Life Incorporated. And today we have an awesome guest, a trauma specialist, Stephanie Carinia. Sorry if I butchered that, Stephanie. She's a psychologist. She does some trauma-informed work, and she does a lot of good things. And Stephanie, I want to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself, and thank you for being on the Psych Life Podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here. So I'm a clinical psychologist, and I have been working now for 13 years, specialized in personality disorders and trauma. And I've also been working in addiction. So my passion is basically to explain psychology to people, because I've seen with my clients how explaining things to them in understandable language can literally change their lives. I've heard often saying I knew this already, but the way you have explained it can be this can be life changing, and that's the reason that I want to spread my message on a wider scale. So I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you, Stephanie. The pleasure's all ours. And you mentioned that you've done some personality disorder work, and that's pretty cool. Even though I brought you on the podcast because I was mostly interested in trauma, but working with those diagnosed that meet the criteria for personality disorders, that can be kind of tough. Can you share a little bit on some of your experience working with those diagnosed with specific personality disorders?
Yeah. So I've been working specifically also with borderline personality disorders, but also with other like avoidant personality, more passive aggressive type, narcissistic. But what I think is very important for people to realize is people often tend to hear personality disorder as in thinking a meeting of the criteria that's a certain type. Well, what people don't realize is often when they talk about trauma, actually they're referring to personality. When you read on Instagram or social media, that is a trauma response, right? You often see that's a trauma response. Often what they're referring to, that has become now a personality response. So personality disorders often is nothing else than defense mechanisms that developed as a way to survive the childhood trauma.
And you raise something very interesting there, and it's something that we always bring up on the Psych Life Podcast. And I'm always saying this over and over. Disorders, clinical disorders, whether they're personality disorders or whatever diagnosis we give someone in the mental health profession, it's just that they meet a criteria. They meet an array of symptoms. They are not that diagnosis. And that's pretty much what you said with that comment, that when someone says, that's a trauma response, right? That's my trauma response or whatnot. It's almost like it's ingrained into their personality. In your work, do you ever have to try and distinguish and separate that? Because some clinicians, they don't even like the DSM too much, although I find it as a useful tool for us to communicate like a disorder. Like if you're talking about narcissistic personality disorder, I know what you mean because of the criteria. But how do you go about that? Like, for example, some clinicians will look at it through a trauma lens, and then other clinicians will go and look at it through specifically a DSM-5 clinical lens where they're looking at personality. Do you try and separate it? Do you use a specific lens, or do you adapt?
So first of all, people need to realize that the criteria, the Diagnostical Statistical Manual, for instance, are designed for people to be able to, clinicians to be able to communicate with each other, to know what they're talking about. Otherwise, you need to describe the whole person every time to the specific criteria. It is also designed for you to have an indication what kind of treatment could be helpful. What I've noticed in my personal work, that sometimes I even didn't think of what the diagnosis is specifically with a client, because I'm focused much more in the underlying defense mechanisms, because in the end, that's what we're treating, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And it sounds like you're very client-centered and person-centered, and you have no idea how many times I've seen clients where they'll ask me, so what personality disorder do I have? What do I have? And it's like, okay, the fact that you're asking so much, I don't want to actually tell you what you have, even though I do say you meet these symptoms for this, and I have to go through the whole spiel and, like you mentioned earlier, psychoeducate them on why I'm diagnosing them with this specific disorder and why that's not a lifelong thing. It's just a certain array of symptoms that they meet within a specific time frame. So I'm very glad that we're talking about this and we're differentiating it. It's something we've mentioned on this podcast several times, and I think our audience really appreciates it because it's a reminder. Now, there was something in specific, right, when it comes to trauma, and I mentioned to you off the air that I wanted to talk about, and it's kind of why I wanted to bring you on. I read an article a couple years ago, and it was talking about epigenetics, and what they used two sample groups. One was World War II, those that were victims of World War II in the concentration camps, and they specifically grabbed those from the Jewish population. And then they had another group that were also Jewish, but they never experienced anything involving World War II. They were either on the other side of the world or what have it. Then they grabbed DNA samples from their parents, those that were in World War II, victims of World War II in the concentration camps, and those that were on the opposite side of the world. And they saw that trauma it could be passed down through genes. Now, maybe I went a little too quick for everybody, but I just want everybody to know that trauma is the perception of an event. It's not the event itself. So I could grab two people, they could experience the same event, and one of them leaves scarred mentally almost. And also the study that I just mentioned shows that there's a physical component as well as genes. And the reason I bring this up, Stephanie, and I want to throw it back to you to see what you think. Have you ever heard of this study?
I've heard of it, but I have been working less with this hypothesis in this study. And the reason is that, by the way, so that it is a phenomenon that trauma can already be carried already within the baby. The baby can already be traumatized. If the mother is traumatized, for instance, so it can become in very early already. The stress levels will be immediately high, hyperarousal when the child is born. So yes, that can happen. The way I'm working and the trauma, I'm an EMDR therapist, for instance. The way I'm working is the messages that we receive are the actual trauma. So a lot of people think, for instance, aside from epigenetics, that normally when we develop a PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, for instance, or complex trauma, that the cause is the events, something, a divorce as a child, or a parent dying, or an accident, right? That's normally what people think when they say, I'm traumatized, childhood trauma, something bad happened. What people don't realize, it's not necessarily the event, it's not necessarily the parent that died, it's not necessarily the accident, it's not necessarily that was a very hectic experience. It is the message, the interpretation that they get with it. It's the message that comes with it. So it is the accident is not necessarily the trauma. It's the powerlessness associated with that accident that is the problem. It's the powerlessness that's the problem. So what you do in therapy, and that's also with personality, basically, you try to correct the message. With trauma in this case, you correct what's happening in actual life right now. Is when people look back on that accident, for instance, normally someone with a post-traumatic stress disorder gets immediately very anxious, the powerlessness comes up again. So that comes up, and that's the problem that they're carrying, the fear they are carrying in their daily lives, the hyperarousal. And what you want to do is, through treatment, is that they get a different message, a more adequate message. I'm not powerless anymore, for instance. Or another way of trauma is the guilt they were carrying. Someone passed away and I didn't prevent that person from passing away. They're carrying that guilt. That could also be a post-traumatic stress disorder. So basically with treating, we treat the messages that they have perceived and we correct them to more realistic ones, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, it makes sense. And that sounds just like cognitive behavioral therapy almost, and cognitive therapy to its finest. You talk about how I use the word perception, but you use the word interpreting. They mean the same thing simultaneously.
Yes.
And what type of interventions do you do for those that have struggled through a traumatic event and they perceived or interpreted certain messages from that event? And just for the audience, one more time, trauma is not the event itself, it's the perception of the event, or like Stephanie was so kindly put, the way we interpret the message. What type of interventions do you do? For example, do you try and relive that moment and try and present new messages that could have been interpreted? How do you go about your interventions, if you don't mind sharing, Stephanie?
Yeah, so with EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, for instance, they still don't know exactly how come it works, but basically what happens is that you get the memory again, so you're in it again, but the difference is that now you're gonna be distracted by, for instance, the movement of the eyes, and that the distraction creates the desensitization of that interpretation. So suddenly after that treatment, when you view back that incident, for instance, or several incidents in complex trauma, you will not be affected that much anymore. So you won't feel overwhelmed by powerlessness, or you won't feel overwhelmed by guilt. So you will have more realistic interpretation. So you won't be triggered in everyday life anymore, because that's the problem with trauma.
It almost kind of like disconnects the memory itself. By when you're processing that memory, you're almost doing the movement of where your eyes have to follow. So it kind of distracts and brings a different feeling about that memory. And EMDR is a great treatment modality, because once again, you don't have to resort to certain substances. Sometimes substances and medications are needed, of course, but I always advocate first for lifestyle changes or actual approaches that don't require some sort of substance being put into the body. So you're doing some great work out there. Now, I'm going to ask, some very, very abstract conversation kind of, but it's stuff that really interests us here on the Psych Life Podcast. And for example, there's these clinical words, and we've been using them like trauma or certain personality disorders. I think you mentioned, or we were talking about narcissistic personality disorder, borderline, et cetera, et cetera. But to put it in simple terms, when we have a perception, when an event occurs and we have a certain perception or message that we extract from that event, and people don't realize that everything that we do in life has a butterfly effect. What I do today affects me tomorrow in ways I don't see. And what I do tomorrow is going to affect me moving forward in ways that I don't see. Just because I see it, just because I don't see it, that doesn't mean it's not affecting me. What are some of the implications that can have on a person if trauma isn't addressed?
So when trauma isn't addressed, what happens is that we will be living with these messages. We will be living with these messages, which in childhood may have saved us. For instance, personality-wise, if we were in an emotionally neglectful, had an emotionally neglectful childhood, perhaps our parents took care of us amazingly, all our physical needs were met, everything, the perfect parents. But if they had emotional inabilities because of their own trauma or fragile sense of self, we will be carrying perhaps shame that we have our needs. We will be shameful for having needs. We will carrying the perception that are showing our needs, then we will be a burden. We will be afraid of upsetting other people. Basically, a lot of anxiety, what you hear out there, or high sensitive person, that is the result. But by the way, high sensitive person, that's also their own nature and the temperament and everything and genetics. So that aside, but when the needs are not met, then people can develop the idea that they're being a burden, or they are afraid that they will, perhaps if they had a loving, caring, but self-involved parent, they will perhaps project that parent, that selfishness of that parent unconsciously to innocent other people. That means, we call it transference. That means that in everyday life, they will be anticipating other people without really trusting them. They will be afraid that those people will be thinking of their own needs and not of their needs, in their own interest and not of their interest, that they will be rejected, that they will be angry with them. People will be suppressing their own anger, which is very dangerous if we suppress our anger on the long run. So these incorrect messages that saved us as a child, because the child needed to feel that the child was the burden. The child needed to feel that the child was not worthy, because if the child would realize that the parent perhaps is emotionally unavailable, that would be so unsafe. We need our parent to be, the almighty, because otherwise there goes our safety, if that makes sense. So the children really need to believe that they are the bad ones, but in adulthood, we are already safe. We don't need that anymore. So we need to free ourselves from those defense mechanisms.
And the part of trauma, it's almost like you're saying, is the inability to remain neutral to outside stimuli, almost always having to be hypervigilant, like you say. And sometimes this hypervigilance can come through a trigger. And I greatly agree with that message. But, when we experience an event in our lives that we perceive is a danger, and we use it, and the danger that we perceive is due to us trying to survive, it's like our brain saying something's wrong, and it completely changes the course of our development. And I'm not just talking about adolescent development, I'm talking about adult development as a whole. People, sometimes they don't want to look in the mirror and challenge. We're talking about trauma, so I don't want to say challenge their belief system, although that's kind of part of it, but they don't want to look in and actually open Pandora's box and look at the scary stuff. I always tell all the people listening to the podcast or whether they watch our educational videos that it's so important for us to reflect about our own lives, about our past, to answer questions that we have about ourselves, to answer and question the false beliefs that we have about ourselves. But some people say that they try and reject that component, and they just want to focus on dealing with moving forward in life without addressing some of their past traumatic events. Now, I'm not, PTSD is something very serious, but we all have some insecurities. We all have perceptions to events that have really changed the course of our development and the way we see things. How important is it for you, and not only for yourself, but for your clients to engage in this type of self-reflection about past events, whether they meet the criteria for PTSD or not? At the end of the day, what we perceive about events, like we mentioned earlier, has a butterfly effect.
I love your question, because what you're asking is, to what degree should we just be working on ourselves, right? To improve the quality of our lives, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, yeah.
And that makes sense, because that's what we are being taught everywhere. We need to heal, we need to this, we need to that, right? And of course, if assuming that you want to have a higher quality of life, assuming that you want to go through life more easily without having unnecessary problems in your relationships, including with the relationship with yourself, then we would assume that you want to self-reflect to be able to grow from it. Of course, then, to be able to self-reflect depends also on the extent to which we are prone to look at the solution of our problems within ourselves, because the more externalizing people will look at for the solution outside of themselves, because they actually believe that the problem lies outside of themselves. And even if the problem would lie inside themselves, they expect other people to take care of it. Or and other people, the more internalizers, will blame themselves for everything, even if it's not their fault. So that's the other. So that's the other end of the spectrum. And what you also need to understand with the example that you're giving, that some people are just like, no, I just want to, go forwards. Don't look back. Don't look at the moments. Don't perhaps even enjoy them, but just go forward, right? Don't forget that to be able to grow and self-reflect, sometimes we will need guidance. We will need a safe haven, like a therapist. They say the real healing goes through attachment, because that's the way we were brought up initially, right? As a baby, we also needed the attachment to grow emotionally.
And sometimes working with my clients, it'll take about 2, and sometimes people don't want to hear this, but sometimes it'll take about 2 to 3 months before the real therapy starts. And I'm not embarrassed to say that sometimes, and it's because of what you just mentioned. You mentioned the word attachment, but I like to use it, and it's a good word. It's not a bad word, but I also use the word, the therapeutic alliance, for it to be strong, to be able to continue working. I always, and I have a post about this, I've done a video about this, how if something bothers us about the outside world, about another person, let's say, about the way things transpired, it's a reflection of us, not the outside world. Now, when I say this, a lot of times I get pushback saying, how can you say that? If someone calls me a name, it's not me, it's them. But when someone mentions that, I tell them that they need to dig deeper, because why is it that what that person says bothers them if it's not true? And obviously it's because there's some insecurity issues there. And yeah, obviously I'm not going to act like no one's ever influenced or bothered by what happens in the outside world. But when we catch ourselves and we turn the unconscious conscious, it gives us an opportunity to learn about ourselves. Why do you think people are so resistant to that? They're so resistant to saying, oh, that person did this, that really bothers me. And they try and, like, all of a sudden they want to make laws against that person. They want to call the police. They want to do this. But really what they should be doing is they should be looking inside themselves. Why do you think people are so resistant?
A great question. Because it would be so much easier if people would just be able to go to their wound and ask themselves the question, how come this is triggering me, right? Instead of what they're doing now, shoot the messenger, right? Shoot the trigger. They're shooting the trigger, basically. Well, there's no point in shooting the trigger if the pain actually comes from the wound that is being triggered, right? We need to heal the wound, right?
And the wound is inside, and sometimes the wound can also be a false belief. But where did that false belief stem from? And it goes so much. I think you hit it on the spot. It goes so deep sometimes that it can be what you said earlier. People just don't want to deal with it. Or the second one, it requires a more in-depth analysis, and our brains have become lazy. Talking.
I can add to that, by the way, because what I also want to try to say is that you need to not forget that not everyone, and I posted on this or created a video the other day on Instagram, that what wasn't taught, what they didn't teach us in high school is that what we need, they taught us what we need on a physical level and biology and everything. They didn't tell us that in psychology, among other things, we need a sense of self. That is the way I describe it, inner safe space, where you feel that you are worthy, you are okay just the way you are enough. There's no good nor bad, you are just intrinsically good, and it's safe. So you as a person are okay, you're good enough. When we have raised with sufficient, safety, and we have developed a sense of self, then we can respond in the way you described perfectly when something happens, and then we are gonna be able to be curious as to what has happened. How come this is triggering me? How come did that person respond in that way at me? Did I do something in the interaction perhaps too? It takes two to tango often, right? And then there is room for curiosity. But if there wasn't sufficient safety, emotional safety at home, I'm not talking about the amazing physical needs, everything was perfect on the outside, I'm talking about the emotional. If the child hasn't developed this emotional safe space, the sense of self, especially with narcissism, that becomes very clear, then there is no inner safe space. And for us to be able to process criticism, or these triggers, someone being bad, mean to us or whatever, to be able to process that and grow from it, not let us bother it, we need a safe space. If we don't have that, it's like as if we have a wound and you're putting salt on it. You cannot expect that you won't be like exploding and defending yourself.
The whole, I love how you bring up the womb and you bring it back to almost like an earlier part of development that happened within a person's lifespan. I really like that a lot. And because it shows that you're aware on the butterfly effect, as I call it, but a lot of people don't like that term. But basically how what happens earlier on completely changes the course of what's going to happen for the rest of our lives. And the fact that I know that you mentioned that I believe you're from Holland, if I'm not mistaken. Am right, Stephanie? And I don't know how the school system is there, but here in the U.S., I grew up here in Miami, Florida. I've traveled a decent amount, but here in the United States, there's no curriculum in that to try and teach mental health to kids, to try and find that sense of self, to try and identify anxiety or autism or to accept kids for what they are. It's almost like they're letting YouTube and access to this information just take its course. And part of it is because of here in the United States, we don't like big government, right? So the federal government doesn't want to get too involved in the education system. The states, every single state is different. And then you have the counties, and a lot of people are still, they don't want to accept the importance of mental health or to find a sense of self. If you're an adult and you're 50 and you've worked your whole life and you have kids now that maybe are 12, you're probably thinking to yourself, I had to work. What do they need to have mental health classes? I never had it. What they need is to be strong. But the research is showing what you're saying, which is we need to find a sense of self. We need to find a balance and understand who we are so we can be able to process events that happen in the outside world and reflect it back to us and do the internal work ourselves instead of trying to get mad at somebody because they triggered us. But you know what, Stephanie, science has shown, though, that when we become upset, when we get very emotional, the chemistry in our brain changes and almost like the logic and reasoning part shuts off. So someone can say that our emotional responses when we are in that active survival state, we can't think. It's happening in an unconscious level. We lose our sense of awareness, but to train ourselves, like you mentioned in this class, that in this, utopia class, if it existed, at least here in the US, I don't know about other parts, but if it existed, I think we'd be able to respond in a lot better way.
So that assuming, I totally agree that psychoeducation is the first step of awareness. But for instance, with the sense of self, that is complicated. That is emotional nurturing that needs to happen somewhere. If it's not going to happen at home, perhaps with an aunt or a family member or other relative. But unfortunately, that's not something we can teach them at school, I think. But but if we become aware of it, perhaps then children as well. That's why I really underestimated. I'm very positively surprised by social media, by the information we're getting. I'm not saying that lives can be necessarily changed, because often that requires therapy or group healing, basically, in whatever form. That can be very powerful. but it can open up a lot of information to people. So for instance, what I also often speak about is that with abuse, childhood abuse, at least that is terrible and is very incredibly damaging, but at least it is visible. Narcissistic abuse, the controlling type, those kind of things are more visible, for instance, and then you can seek specifically treatment, right? But the more hidden trauma is often neglected. So when your emotional needs are not being met, can be extremely traumatic, and it haunts you for the rest of your life. And that's why I think it's very important. I'm posting a lot on hidden trauma, the shame that we're feeling, the fear that we are carrying, feeling that we're not allowed to have our own needs. People really underestimate the damage that is causing. People really underestimate the damage that is being caused of anger that is being suppressed, because then it will come out in a passive aggressive way towards the children, and the children never be angry. So these are also hidden wounds. And I think awareness on these hidden traumas is very important for people to start identifying that too.
Good. Sorry, it's that you brought up something really good. The social media component. I mention all the time how we're not wired to live like this. This is new. This is completely new. Humans have been around for 5,000 years, maybe more. And we've gone through an evolution series. Now what the changes that happened, let's say between 2020 and 2021, the change that happened in that 1 year used to take 30 years to happen. So the world's changing so fast in a rate that we're not wired we're not built like this. And you introduce social media, you introduce now, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but the change in dynamics. So, for example, the family used to be integrated. Now the divorce is high as ever. There used to always be a parent and a caregiver in the home. Now it's almost like the kid comes home and they're alone all the time. And I know, because I'm an outpatient therapist, and you're seeing all these components. So what do? They reach out on social media. They go to YouTube. They find their favorite rapper. They talk to their friends. They're so easily influenced by different groups that back then you didn't have so many lines of inquiries to be able at your disposal to fill your mind up. It was always mom and dad and the brothers and sisters, little Tommy next door, and everybody knew. Now there's so much access to information that I don't think kids, they know how to manage that. They obviously don't. And the fact that they go and they check out what's my favorite rapper doing and what are they talking about in the interview, I'm not sure that's necessarily the right person for them to be trying to gather information about life. And I think that's causing such a detrimental factor for the youth right now, that we don't know, like you mentioned, hidden trauma. We don't know the long-term effects this is going to happen on our species. And people are kind of surprised that these topics that we're talking about involve in-depth analysis, which obviously you've thought about deeply. And I saw your IGTV, some of your IGTV work, and obviously you're doing some great work. You're using social media as a positive impact on Instagram or for others, or YouTube, or whoever wants to check out your content. But there's other people that, they're going to try and find acceptance in different ways, especially kids. And that's, I think, it's a big component. It's also, we talked about the school aspect, but this specific component that you're talking about is so important, and it's not even being talked about enough. And I think it's not talked about enough because people don't want to deal with it. What are we basically asking of them? One parent to stop working? How's the money going to come? And these are very complex topics, but topics that need to be talked about. Sorry, you were going to say something, Steph?
No, I 100% agree with you. And what I also noticed, what I think on the other side, the positive note, is that there is such a demand. How do you say demand? There's such a huge need for communities as well on social media. So if you look at the mental health, so many people are just craving for this knowledge. So that's very positive. Craving for the community feeling. So what's actually what normally has happened for ages, right? The community, the need for information, the need to grow, the need to feel connected. the need to understand ourselves, the people that want to grow, of course. So there's a huge, tremendous need. I'm surprised. I never, ever expected when I started my Instagram account that people would be this interested and like absorbing everything and asking questions and to such depth. Things that I've heard, like people understanding that they were never in touch with their own passive aggressiveness. And they said, now finally I understand why my husband and my sons were always complaining about me being, but I thought I was the sunshine because I was never angry. And people are so interested, they want to learn so much. So on the other hand, we also see that healthy development, that they use social media to create community as well in the healthy aspect.
Yeah, you're on point with that. I have no disagreement there. And you're right that there are some good things happening. The freedom of so much access to information. If I want to learn something, I don't have to pay $2,000 for a class at a university. I can literally go on YouTube. I can get a book in the library and I can learn on my own and I think sometimes we take this for granted. I take it for granted. The freedom and the access of information that exists and the ability to form communities like Psych Life, like your page as well. And that's a beautiful thing. And to be able to collaborate, I think somewhere else that's not in the United States. I'm here in the United States and we're collaborating right now in different time zones and everything. I think the issue though, and I'm sorry, I feel like I'm ranting. I hope I'm not to the audience out there, but I think there's a big issue when you have celebrities talking about mental health and talking about things that they claim they understand. I'm not taking the right away to talk about it. I believe in freedom of speech and in liberties and everything, but I think they're doing more harm in talking about mental health. And then later, let's say they're making a rap song about how cool it is that they robbed somebody and they rode away in the Mercedes. I just feel like there's a complete mixed message there. And the kids and the youth are the ones that eat it up, and they don't have the complex reasoning skills at that moment to be able to interpret what's real, what's not, what's okay, they don't have a sense of abstract boundaries. And I think that's where I think the big issue that exists today, and it's not being addressed because no one knows how to address it. It's the elephant in the room. So yeah, no, that's all I had. I don't want to go on that rant, but because I feel like we need a whole nother podcast episode for that.
Well done, and you didn't rant. And well done, because you're saying something important. If these children have a certain role model, like a rapper, and if that role model unfortunately has their own interest in mind, right? Pretending they have the interest in mind of the fans, but have their own interest in mind, right? Then that can give the child mixed messages, and then that can have effects. Absolutely. I also think that ideally, the children that would be more susceptible to that would be the children that would have lacked the emotional care at home.
Yes,
that would
that's
be
a good point.
Yeah.
That's a good point. That is a very good point. So, Stephanie, I'm so glad we had you on the podcast. I really appreciate it. We're running out of time, but I want to give you the opportunity to share with the audience where can they find you, and any of your social medias, your website, whatever you got, and some of the things that you're working on behind the scenes.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So yeah, people can find me on Instagram, Psychologist Stephanie, or my website, psychologiststephanie.com. Have a look also at my resources. I think that's it. Generally, every now and then I do IG lives. I've done challenges to educate people on hidden trauma basically, and our personality, because I believe that understanding ourselves is creating self-compassion, is self-love. So yeah. No,
I appreciate it. And just for the Psych Life audience, and just for Stephanie, I'm going to put Stephanie's information down in the caption if you're watching on YouTube. If you're watching on Spotify, I am going to put the @ and her Instagram profile name. So you can definitely just go to Instagram and write in her username and definitely access her account. And I appreciate you, Stephanie, for coming on the platform. And of course, I appreciate the audience out there listening. I don't care if it's one person listening or 100 or 10 or 1,000. I appreciate you guys, and I hope this content is valuable for everybody. So again, Stephanie, take care, and take care, Psych Lifers, all right? And as always, Psych Life.
And thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
No problem. Thanks, Stephanie. Take care, guys, all right?